Welcome to Booktopia TV. I'm John Purcell, and I'm here with Hugh Mackay to talk about his new book, The Art of Belonging. Welcome, Hugh.
Thanks very much, John.
The Art of Belonging. Now, it's written from the perspective of a social researcher. What is a social researcher?
It's a question I ask myself, although I've been doing it for a long time, almost 60 years. A social researcher is a person who studies people's behaviour in social settings. Different from a sociologist. A sociologist studies the society sort of en masse. I'm a social psychologist come researcher. So what I'm interested in is how does it work when people try to live together, when they try to interact? And I've spent all my life as a researcher watching that, sometimes through quantitative statistical surveys measuring people's behaviour, what television programs they watch or how they vote, etc. But for most of my working life, it's been more diagnostic, more exploratory than that, sitting in people's lounge rooms, listening to them chat about whatever the subject is, raising kids or reading books or having a holiday. I've always been interested in everything that people do, because it seems to me even the miniatures of people's lives tell us something really important about what makes humans tick.
I now have this image in my head which I can't shake of you in a similar role to David Attenborough amongst the gorillas,
Exactly.
sitting on the carpet in his lounge room going, and now he's going to pour himself another beer.
Well, that's true. I mean, I remember one project that my colleagues and I did where we were trying to work out how people actually choose the television programs they watch. Not just knowing they do switch, but what goes on. And this is many years ago when it was more of an issue than it is now. So we did pretty much an Attenborough thing. I mean, we camped in the corner of people's lounge rooms for hours and said, just go on doing what you do. Only would you please talk about it? You know, if you're changing the channel, or just say what you're thinking.
Yeah.
So we do that kind of thing. And the main technique that I've used through my career as a social researcher is the non-directive group discussion technique.
What's that?
Well, that means getting small groups of people who know each other, friends, neighbours, workmates, just to meet informally in their natural habitat, to use the Attenborough line, which might be the canteen at work or the lounge room at home or the pub where they meet on a Friday, whatever it might be, and give them a topic and just let them talk. I've always, the great discipline of my research career has been don't ask questions, because if you ask questions, people will feel obliged to give you an answer, and then you'll never know whether they would have said that if you hadn't asked them the question.
So, I mean, with this way of looking at the world, there's no wonder that you turn to writing novels as well. I mean, this as an outlet. I mean, this is, what you're describing is the very formal version of what most novels would say. That's what I do.
Yes. And of course, that's exactly what they do, except it comes out of their imagination, whereas in my case, it came out of listening to all these thousands of people over these many years talking. But I mean, my research reports always had a very heavy component of verbatim quotes from the conversation and descriptions of what was going on, what was happening to the energy level in the room, and were they leaning forward or leaning back, and all that kind of stuff, quite apart from what they were actually, what conclusions we were drawing. The material always seemed to me to be crucial. And so when I started writing social analysis, presenting social research for the general reader, not just for clients of research reports, I used the same method, and I've always included a lot of stories to try to make understanding the analysis easier. And in my latest book, it's almost a 50-50 split between the analysis and the story.
So you create, in your new book, The Art of Belonging, you create Southwood as a suburb, a fictional suburb, and you then describe the goings-on within that.
Yes. Well, the first thing was the name, I had to choose somewhere. I thought I had to choose somewhere that was not didn't exist. There is no Southwood in Australia. Check the postcode book. We've got Northwoods and Eastwoods and Westwoods, but we don't have any Southwoods. So I thought this is a perfect name, because what I wanted was a name that sounded kind of generic, a bit like calling someone John Everyman. Yeah. Southwood sounds like an Australian suburb, but there isn't one, or a town. And my idea there was to try and distill all the stuff that I've been listening to from real people over all these years, and instead of quoting those people verbatim, to move it a little bit further into a fictional narrative. It's a suburb of an unnamed Australian city, based on many suburbs and towns, so it's an amalgam. But the idea was, and I begin with a helicopter ride over Southwood, just looking at this, like so many Australian suburbs, a rather formless place. There's no river, there's no harbour, there's no natural boundary. It's just roofs and streets, goes on and on and on. That's the situation in which most Australians live. So what goes on in a place like that? And if we look at what goes on, what does that tell us about the kind of people we are? So through this book, I've constantly switched from talking about things like the shrinking household, huge revolutionary change in Australian society and in many comparable Western societies. Our households are just getting smaller and smaller. Our houses are getting bigger, but the households are getting smaller. The single biggest category of household in Australia is the single person household. About 26 or 27% of all households contain just one person.
Is that part of the ageing society?
Ageing is one factor. High divorce rate is another factor. A lot of people left over from divorces. More young people than previously going through periods of living alone as a sort of symbolic gesture of independence. A lot of these people who live in solo households are there temporarily on their way through to some other arrangement. But so there's a phenomenon. So rather than just saying, well, there's a phenomenon, I thought, let's get right inside a variety of single person households and just see what the life story is that brought someone to the point of living alone, either voluntarily or involuntarily. What does it feel like? What are the consequences of it for their relationship with the street and the suburb, and so on? So that's an example of how I just tried to wear the two hats of the social researcher, looking at various ways in which we are changing, and the novelist, I suppose, saying, well, let's express that in stories that bring it to life.
So the book is about community. It's about how we act in community. And one of the things that keeps coming up more regularly is this sort of horror that people have that someone has died all alone within their community without being noticed for months, sometimes even years. And people talking and being interviewed on the street and saying, I couldn't believe this would happen in our community.
Yes.
There's a lot of use in tragedy and in natural disasters. One of the first words that comes out of people's mouths in that is the community will pull together.
Yes.
How real is that community at the moment in Australia as you see it? Or is it just a word that people use to make themselves feel better at that particular time?
Very interesting question, John, because I think you put your finger on something that's a sort of subtext of this book. We're obsessed with talking about communities, and even the word village. I mean, the word village has become a sort of magic word in our vocabulary. A retirement village, a vertical village for a high-rise apartment block. Everyone dreams of living in a village. Now, where does that come from? The answer to my researcher's mind is that it comes from the feeling that we've lost a lot of that we're obsessing about communities and about the life of the village because we feel we had it, and now we feel we're losing it, and we want to recapture it. And in fact, the book is, in a way, about how you might recapture it. The subtitle of the book is "It's not where you live, it's how you live."
Yeah.
And I'm really making the point that we could create even the most sterile, architecturally sterile street in Australia into a vibrant village-like community. It all depends on the extent to which we're prepared to engage, to connect, to associate. Not that we want to become best friends with our neighbours, that's not the characteristic of a community, but the characteristic of a community is that we recognise that our social identity is actually more important than our personal identity. And another message of this book, which was also a bit of a message in my previous book, The Good Life, time to stop worrying so much about who am I, this endless quest for self-knowledge. The really interesting, the really significant question is, who are we? Mm-hmm. Are we creating the kind of society, community, neighbourhood, street that we would be proud to say we belong to? Because by nature we need to belong. Our interdependence is more important psychologically than our independence.
Well, I've just moved into a local neighbourhood that had a very strong relationship, and it's changing. People live there for 40 years, and their kids have moved out, and most of them are now retired. Yes. And there's this new influx of people my age coming in, and it's disrupted the neighbourhood. They've reached out because they want to know everyone around them, because they've always known everyone around them. Yes. And we've sort of come in and sort of been more reluctant because we don't really
get engaged, John.
Yes, to get engaged. That's the answer to the problem. That's what I
invite them in.
Yeah, so invite them in.
Not to be best friends, but to be neighbours. Yeah. To recognise that there is. It's a point I make in this new book. There is something special about the local neighbourhood. We can talk about online communities and workplace communities and book clubs and sporting clubs and drinking groups and adult education clubs. They're all perfectly valid little communities, but there's this special one, the place where we all live together. And if we can't figure out a way to get along with the people in that street, then we will have cases like someone dies and no one knows for a week, or someone has been bereaved or ill or something and needs a bit of support, and we didn't know they needed support because we weren't sufficiently in touch.
So can the average reader pick this book up and use it as a guide to doing that, to making those changes in their life?
I hope so. It's not set out like some kind of how-to book, but I think as you work through this, the combination of the analysis explaining how our society has been changing, and then all these little stories showing the difficulties that people have and the way they do pull through often, and particularly the point you mentioned earlier, the way they respond to a crisis, death of a child or some accident in the street. It's a book of examples of how people have done it, and I would hope people will say, actually, that's not so hard. Our street could work like that if we put a bit more effort in. I mean, communities, neighbourhoods rely on human relationships. Communities don't just happen. They don't just survive. You can have people living in a street who are not a community at all. But it seems to me we do need communities to sustain us, and communities need us to put in the effort, as with every other human relationship. We always say, a good marriage is hard work. It is, and so is a good community.
Thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a delight talking to you. So many ideas in my head at the moment. We could go for ages. Thank you, and thank you for joining us at Booktopia TV.
A great pleasure. Thanks, John.
You can buy The Art of Belonging and all of Hugh Mackay's books at booktopia.com.au right now.